I want to thank you for being here today, Natalie. I've told you already through emails, I've been reading your newsletter pretty religiously over the last year. And I think it's probably the only newsletter I read because it's so powerful what you share and how vulnerable you are. So thank you for coming. And it's really an honor to meet you virtually.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Sade. That is such a lovely testament because you don't know how your words, how your work, how your message is being received. All I know is that this is how I have to write and how I have to share. But and so sometimes you're saying stuff and you're going like, does that resonate? Does that like hit? And you realize you just can't get too caught up in like, what is my impact? You know? It's
I
like
mean,
you just gotta say
yeah,
what you gotta say.
a lot of times you find your impact and how much you resonate by how many people unsubscribe.
That's so true. That's so true. Like, you really hit into the bones of something when you get, like, a load of unsubscribes.
When you hit a nerve and with you as well, like the topics that you share about your personal relationship with family, about things that you're discovering, it's things that we hide so deep down. And
Mhm.
having it right there on your screen talking about this, someone who's doing what you secretly wish you would do,
Yeah.
it can be triggering.
Mhm.
And I think with the newsletter, why it really hits deep is it's almost like there's more of a personal element to it.
Mhm.
Whereas on a blog, you are thinking of other things of how can someone find this? How
Mhm.
will this be searchable? Will someone resonate with this? And with the newsletter, it's almost these are my thoughts. It's almost like a diary in some ways, which is
Mhm.
really amazing to see. And I know you were saying that the topics have kind of evolved, but now you're focusing and thinking a lot about wayfinding. If you want to just share what that means for you at the moment.
Yeah, the word, it actually came from reading, sort of some of the questions to prep, for our session. And the word that immediately, like, leapt out of me was wayfinding. I was like, "What the hell? Where the hell did that come from?" But I was like, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." Because it's helping people to find the way, as in their way. Not everybody else's way, because a lot of the time as humans, we're trying to do things like by everybody else's idea of it. Oh, let me copy that person. Let me copy that template. Let me follow that blueprint. And, with any luck, that will work out for me. But actually, it doesn't. So it's like, find your way. But it's also finding the way through life. So it is still back to the boundaries and personal relationships piece, like finding your way through these, finding your way through life, and still being more of who you really are along the way. So finding your way along the way.
It's almost like that I always mess up who said this quote. Do you ever have that where you have these incredible
Yeah.
quotes, but you get the totally wrong person? So I think it was Bono, but it probably wasn't, who was saying something about how it was another rock star for sure, about how you find that as you get older, you're becoming who you were always meant to be. And I kind
Mhm.
of see that as the wayfinding. In my interpretation is this idea of you have these elements of who you were that slowly come out a bit more when you discard the baggage, to use the term that you had.
Mhm.
And I see that a lot. Can you talk a bit about, well, I guess we should share your journey. I know a lot of people listening probably will have already heard it, but to share what has wayfinding been for you? And I know this is an impromptu question because this is something we literally just talked about before the episode.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
how it has guided you or the way that you've seen your path through boundaries, through personal relationships.
I am a recovering people pleaser. So, people pleasing is as natural to me as breathing. And so my way was to do the thing that was pleasing, to do the expected, to try to avoid conflict, criticism, disappointment, loss, rejection, a sense of abandonment. And I struggled around boundaries. I'm 46, so I also came up in a time when things like boundaries and feelings and self-care and mental health, they were not in the vocabulary. They were not in the cultural lexicon. And actually, you brought up those things in any, even in a vague form, talking about once and you get a cuff around the head and told to go outside and play or to stop, being spoiled or dramatic or difficult or whatever it might be. And so I came into adulthood looking for love in the wrong places with emotionally unavailable men who were also sometimes pretty shady, struggling with familial relationships with the sense of abandonment from each of my parents, not really having any sense of who I was, but like, oh, well, if I just do like the people pleasing, perfectionist, overthinking, overgiving, over responsible thing the way that I had taught to be, been taught to be, it's like it'll all shake itself out. Instead, I became really ill. And it was interesting what you said about, that rock star quote about, as you get older, and you become more of who you are. And I think you've tried to be so many other ways. You've tried so many various different ways. S- Often being aware of the way, as in your way, that feels so wrong, like having the sense of who you are. And eventually you're like, yeah, you come back to yourself. But before that, there's all the emotional baggage that needs to be shed. And that's an ongoing part of the journey. And so it was becoming really unwell, sort of through the course of like 2003, 2005, with an immune system disease called sarcoidosis. And that really jolted me out of this sort of stupor that I was in, like where you're just like in this fog, you're doing things the expected way you're doing as you're told. And then it's like, well, what are you doing? Like, you're now being told that you're seriously ill, like you're going to be dead, within a decade type of thing. Why are you living your life this way? And what that has then led to is a reclamation of myself from all the ways that people tell you to be, from all the ways that say, you have to do it this way. And that is not something that is easy, but it is very much worthwhile. Again and again, I have to come back to myself. And through it, you're going to find your way. And so a lot of wayfinding, I think, does involve a lot of letting go, which I think makes a lot of us feel really uncomfortable because we always see letting go purely as loss, whereas there is constantly in life this sort of, even when we don't realize it, we're letting go and picking up something else in the process. There's been the shedding of these ideas of myself, shedding of stories and judgments and criticisms and fake rules and obligations in personal relationships where my intimate relationships have flourished. But the ones that were very reliant on me kind of their way or lose your way, they have very much fallen by the wayside. And that includes, and I know that you're aware of this, like breaking up with my mother this year. Amongst all of this, my father died almost 7 years ago now, broken up with my mother this year, all sorts of things can bring up grief. And yet it's better to be me this way.
Yeah. What you said that I really hung on to here is that when you are kind of discovering your way and rediscovering yourself, that something people don't talk about are the casualties
Mm,
of relationships, of identities as well, things that
mhm,
maybe other people valued and by consequence you valued too, but they weren't really something that defined you. And your journey is incredible in this because if we go back to, for example, when you were diagnosed with an incurable illness, I remember reading that you had said, this was one of the first times I said no to them telling me to steroid treatment, that I was
mhm,
going to explore something else, that I'm not confident or I'm not comfortable with forever following your way to
mhm.
my healing. And it feels like since then, your path has been saying no to the things that are obscuring who you are, who you want to be, or how you want to live your life, and then saying yes to the ones that really I love your what is it, the hell yeses that you talk about.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, hard passes and happy yeses, yeah.
Happy yeses. Sorry,
Yeah.
I profanitized that, but yeah.
Oh, listen, I love a profanity. You're talking to the right person on that one.
But I think that you really inspire with that because this is stuff that we know deep down needs to be done. but it's very discouraging because I'm 38, but also from a generation where we don't talk about this. And my generation is now on this border of coming into midlife, and all of these things about how you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to act are being challenged. So I just find it really interesting you saying that I'm finding this space, and it means things like letting go of relationship. Do you feel, for people listening, what, and I know we can't do this in one podcast, but what kind of guidance would you say, having had to let go of a really important relationship with family, for someone else who's listening and thinks, I might need to do that too?
I think that you you've got to take your time. I think it is easy to think, "Oh, I needed to have done this however long ago," but that's not a true reflection of your journey. I think the key is that if your boundaries are evolving and you are endeavoring to show as more of who you really are, there is a natural tipping point, we shall call it, where suddenly it becomes clear that you have evolved so much, and you have your boundaries have evolved, and you've tried various things with this relationship that encompass you having these better boundaries, and you realize that you're probably just holding on by your fingertips. And sometimes that comes about from a sense of a deep sense of knowing, and you feeling called to do that, and maybe that might be the thing that instigates the conversation. But often there will be that plus an event that makes, that tips the balance, that it's like, okay, now it's time. Because the truth is, as humans, I think we try to avoid discomfort even when we don't realize we're doing that. So there is the sense of giving yourself time and also listening. Evolve those boundaries. Be more honest with your yes. And also, as a result of that, you're going to be more honest with your no. And that will reveal to you where, where the rubber hits the road, really, of what is happening in this relationship. Look, some people can have a relationship with certain people in their life, which I did for a time. There's a sweet spot of the relationship where, with the acceptance of who this person is and how your dynamic is, you operate within that. You don't try and spend a week with them when you know that realistically, maybe it's a day, maybe it's a few hours, maybe it's even a couple of days, but beyond that, you're pushing your luck. So you've got to be honest with yourself about what that sweet spot is. And you've got to also be honest about where you may be, even though it can seem so subtle and it can seem so innocent, you're trying to get people to change in some way. Be honest with yourself about where that is showing up, because that can also make it easier for you to make a decision. Because if you're waiting around for somebody to change, that's already telling you a lot. Like, you don't accept that person for who they are. There's a part of you holding out that goes, if I'm just nice enough, if I'm just patient enough, if I just give them this other chance, things will change. Is that fair to this person? Is that fair to you? Is this fair to your relationship? I think a big thing that came out of breaking up with my mother was there are different ways to love people and to respect a relationship. And they don't all involve sitting on top of each other, getting on each other's nerves, trying to force each other to change. It go. Let it take whatever form it is supposed to take, rather than clutching onto it and trying to force it to be something else.
This is a part of relationships that no one really talks about, is that sometimes they're defined by the absence of your interaction, right? That they can't evolve unless you step away.
Mhm.
And what you said too is really powerful about how, if you're waiting and waiting and you're waiting for them to change, that already tells you something. And
Mm.
often, if they're going to change, it requires some sort of action, some powerful change for them, some event. And in fact, you ending that relationship or pausing it or exiting might be that. And it's almost, if you delay doing that, you're stopping them from having that realization too. Not saying it's going to happen, right? But it's
Mhm.
a possibility that they grow and evolve and change because you did that. Again, I
Yeah.
don't wanna give people false hope because there's plenty of people
Yeah.
that don't change.
I think a lot of us as humans, if we're totally honest with ourselves, there's some people pleasing taking place, whether we want to admit to it or not. And there's a part of us hoping that give it enough time, give it enough investment, this person is going to change. The thing about this is boundaries, 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 boundaries. Your relationship isn't going to evolve if your boundaries don't evolve. And your boundaries are as much about your yes as they are about your no. They are the living embodiment of you. So it's everything you say, everything you don't say, everything you do, everything you don't do. It's all a representation of what you're about, your needs, desires, expectations, feelings, and opinions. So, how can we expect our relationships to evolve and to go, to get to a better place? So, it's not about, well, if I evolve my boundaries, then maybe that will make them change their feelings and behavior. No, that's still people pleasing. It's about knowing and owning yourself. And that can feel hard. See, like, you gotta let the chips fall where they may instead of trying to mind trick people, but you will see very quickly where the land lies in your relationships.
Yeah, I love the Jedi mind trick people. It is true. We that some of the behaviors and it is almost manipulations that we come up with to try to get people to almost heal this relationship with us or to be in a way that we can coexist more peacefully or more together. It's exhausting. I think it's emotionally exhausting thinking about that. If you find yourself continually planning and brainstorming, how am I going to do this with this person? How am I going to spend these
Mhm,
days together? It's a big sign, isn't it, of what it is. But you said with boundaries, I want to
mhm.
ask you that specifically because I know this is something you talk a lot about and many people misunderstand about what it involves. What role does vulnerability play in creating our boundaries? Because to say it's easy is a huge lie.
Yeah, I mean, vulnerability, yeah, and that is that willingness to risk allowing ourselves to be seen and heard is something that a lot of us struggle with in some way, shape, or form. Humans, we are designed to be risk averse. Yeah. So back to what I said earlier, if we think we can get something without really having to get vulnerable, we'll try and take the other shortcut. Yeah. But, one of the things I say is no boundaries means no intimacy. So in order to have healthier boundaries, it means having to show more of yourself. You're allowing yourself to be more seen, more heard through the representation of who you are, which also includes the representation of who you're not. And what a lot of people do is they try to disguise that because they're afraid of rejection and abandonment or being judged and the conflict and criticism that might come around that. When we avoid vulnerability, we shut down intimacy, but it also means that we can't have the necessary boundaries because we're pretending to be something we're not. We're suppressing and repressing our needs, desires, expectations, feelings, and opinions, representing that and creating healthier boundaries, which is really just, putting more of a presence of you, allowing yourself to be more visible, but also within your interpersonal relationships. That takes vulnerability. I sometimes notice myself when I have to ask for help and I'm like, oh, and I realize these are opportunities for me to be more vulnerable, asking for the help, admitting that I'm struggling. Like imagine telling somebody, this is how I feel. This is what I need from you or just in life. For some people, just me mentioning that sends a shiver through them because a lot of us are terrified of being seen as needy and too sensitive and difficult and, all the things that we have learned to be terrified of. But without the vulnerability, things are not going to get better. And I think part of the issue around vulnerability is that it's seen as a weakness, like we're exposing ourselves. Because, of course, there's another context, another meaning for vulnerable. So it's like finding, that weak spot, you know, and that can be exploited. But we already know what it's like to have relationships being all closed off and shut down and people pleasing and all the other stuff. That's not really working out too well for us at all.
We have, and you as a writer, of course, can really think in this way conceptually that with vulnerability, there are multiple understandings of it. And the one that we take is I'm weak, which can be a vulnerable definition, but actually it's more of a strength because you don't have to be hidden and use the energy for that. Your energy can go to something else, like creating the relationship. But it is really scary to say things like, I want, I need, because you think you're going to be too demanding. You think
Mhm.
someone's going to say no, and they might say no, but
There's no point in pretending that you don't have needs. So, this whole idea that we're low maintenance, or that we don't have needs, or that other people's needs are more important than ours, you know, we're bullshitting ourselves here, like big time. The delusion of that means that we then feel unseen and unheard within our relationships. In fact, not just within our relationships, you even feel unseen and unheard to ourselves. Imagine we're the one person that we have to deal with, like day in, day out, from the day we're born to the day we die. Imagine feeling unseen and unheard by yourself, feeling unrepresented by you in your own life. I've been guilty of this. I think that, cultural conditioning, for instance, it's in various cultures, like in African Caribbean culture, I think in quite a number of Asian cultures and in a lot of South American cultures as well, which clearly is a lot to do with the histories over the last several hundred years in particular. There has been this thing of like present as strong, because if you give the impression that we are weak, then that is something that can affect us as a unit. It affects how we are perceived. So I have had to be the strong black girl who has it all together. The thing is that trying to act like you're strong all the time is exactly where you will create weakness, because you will breach your boundaries, you will go way past your limits, you will exploit yourself and allow yourself to be exploited. Sometimes we're going to experience all the things that we already experience, even when we are hiding from vulnerability: stress, rejection, criticism, loss, conflict, disappointment. And sometimes, yeah, there's sort of sense of abandonment, even if that's technically not what happened. So there is vulnerability in that, but actually, we create a lot more problems for ourselves by avoiding vulnerability than we do by actually being vulnerable. Like, the problems that we create avoiding vulnerability amount to being catastrophic.
what's the expression? You've opened the power keg, but how do you close it again? Has that happened that you can recall? I'm sure it's happened, but if there's a
Oh,
memory
yeah.
that surfaces for you.
Well, I think, even with my getting ill, it's embarrassing to admit, but about 6 months before I was diagnosed with my illness, I found a lump in my finger. It was a hard lump, and I remember going, I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to have this hard lump inside your finger like that." I'm like, "Is that cancer?" And then I shut it out of my mind. I was like, "This doesn't exist. Not gonna deal with this." And then other symptoms started happening. Eyesight is diminishing. I was such a machine that I was able to camouflage how ill I was, bearing in mind that I would wake up and I'd be screaming in pain from the joint pain. I was putting eye drops at one point in my left eye every hour. Every hour. I was doing this throughout work. I was disguising all of this. I missed one target in the entire time when I was working in that company. I was often way over target. That says a lot about me. This is not a case of that everybody on my team it was this like, I've got to compensate for the fact that I am ill. I must present as being strong. I didn't want to admit what was going on. And then my spleen became grossly enlarged. And I was, and I look back and it's appalling that fear of revealing myself, because that involved asking for help, admitting that I was struggling, admitting how ill I was, admitting that something was really, really wrong. And I hated the thought that, I don't know, people would see me as weak. And the things I put myself through.
I have shivers with this because I think everyone listening has had probably just a tiny percentage of this, right? Experiencing this. Maybe some people have felt the full extent of that kind of illness. But what resonates so much is that you compensated. that the response, instead of being open and seeking support, was, "I'm going to push harder. I'm gonna do more." And I wonder, I try not to put it too much in the female versus masculine narrative, but I do
Mhm.
wonder how much of it comes from being a woman and in
Yeah.
that space. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that the narrative around womanhood is so murky and complex, and there is this sense that we have to ascribe to the version of womanhood that we've been told is for us. And we must appear to be super woman, invincible. Invincible also means invulnerable. And there is this sense as well, because of the narrative around womanhood, that if you admit or just straight up show that something about you or your life is less than perfect, does not fit the boxes that society says that it is supposed to, that is going to endanger your ability to be successful and happy. And so when you admit all of that and you tie that in with the fact that as women, we are also socialized to compete with each other, to act as if there is this tiny ass bucket that has a limited amount of like good lucks, relationships, success, whatever it is that we're going after, the zero sum game. So, oh, well, that's me screwed. I mean, I think there's a lot of women who have felt that way. There were so many things at play. I remember speaking to a coach last year who said that before she became a coach, that she was working, for one of these big investment banks in central London. And because of her size, she was so afraid of being perceived as lazy that she would work 12, 15-hour days because she never wanted them to see her as the fat, lazy woman. You can guess what happens next. She had a breakdown, didn't she? She had burnout. And all because she had internalized this narrative that your body screams that you are lazy and feckless and that you are undeserving of love, care, trust, and respect.
It feels so much more jarring when you think about what would have happened in that situation if it were a man instead. If there was a man who didn't have the ideal shape, so to speak, that would never have been a concern. I mean, how
Yeah.
many people like that are comfortable in power and in credibility, and to see it makes it in some ways, and I wanna make sure I ask you this question before we go, because it makes it that much harder for this wayfinding that we've been talking about, because
Mm.
any person is gonna struggle to find themselves again, to find their way, to discard the baggage of others. But as a woman in particular, if you're raised that way especially, it's extra stuff that you have to shed. It's
Mhm.
extra things to look at. What have you found most helpful for you in finding your way as a person, but also specifically as a woman? Like, what has been the most powerful realizations for you in that?
In my book, The Joy of Saying No, I talk about these 5 styles of people pleasing: gooding, efforting, avoiding, saving, and suffering. And they tell you in and of themselves what you're driven by: being good, effort, you know, avoiding discomforting, saving, so the fixing, helping, rescuing, suffering, I bleed for you type of thing. Me, primarily effort. And so a big shift for me in identity, in, forging healthier relationships is really becoming aware of where the efforting piece shows up for me. Because it's like there's a part of me that thinks that in order to be the right type of woman, the right type of person, that I have to be perfect. And at the same time, I know that I am not perfect. So there then becomes this tension, this tightrope of you need to be perfect and you need to like try to do all the things that limit rejection. And you need to make sure you stay attractive. and you need to make sure that you look younger than you are, and you need to make sure this, and you need to make sure that. It's just so tiring. And so a big shift for me has been really trying to break out of the perfectionism, because perfectionism is just people pleasing by another name. Use perfectionism as a way to feel worthy and deserving, and then you just continuously feel like, the hell, what's going on? Is nothing ever good enough? We as women, we have been given these advances and opportunities that women half a lifetime ago didn't have. So how can I be taking it easy? Why aren't I more ambitious? Why aren't I this? It's so tedious. I know that that has a ripple effect already on my teenage daughters. Like, they're far more assertive at their age than I was, probably even 10 years 10 years ago. When I hear my daughters articulate certain things, I'm like, "Okay, well, I know what this world is, but I also think, okay, I think you're gonna be okay."
And I love that, especially because you just said the most important thing is if you're not doing it for yourself, you're doing it to model the behavior for someone else so that they can see what it looks like to be assertive, to express your needs, to not just sit down and take whatever someone wants to shove in front of you and to not overcompensate either, to articulate when you need to stop, when you need support. All of that
Mhm.
is stuff that I don't know for you, but I don't know, it wasn't really modeled for me,
No.
and it's like we have to be the ones now,
Yeah.
and how powerful will it be too with your daughters in who they model that to, whether it be their own children or other women in their lives. It just keeps growing and becomes more powerful. I wanna make sure we ask about your book, The Joy of Saying No, because you mentioned it, and it's something that probably anyone who's listened this far in the episode would really find helpful. So can you share where they can get your book and also how they can connect with you, the different ways to follow you and your work?
Thank you. Yeah, The Joy of Saying No is available, I think pretty much in most bookstores, particularly online. And it really goes a lot into the practicals of breaking this cycle of people pleasing and reclaiming yourself so that actually you can live your life, happily and authentically. As you mentioned, I write a newsletter called Unknowing Yourself. It's on Substack. It's at natalielue.substack.com. I have my long running blog, baggagereclaim.com, which has started to date again, little snippets about all things, yeah, relationships. Oh, I've got a podcast called the Baggage Reclaim Sessions, which is on all podcast players, which has got 80 episodes on there, where I dive deep into many of the things that we've talked about today.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to include links for everyone listening. I really highly, especially recommend your newsletter and your book. The newsletter, I think, is something that it really makes you reflect every time it comes into your inbox. It's a nice thing in your inbox versus
Mm.
all the crap that we get in instead. It's like you want to go and show up when it comes in.
Oh,
And
lovely.
I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's amazing to speak with you and your stories. And as I said, this could be a year-long show just interviewing you, but I think we got some of the most important highlights that you're focusing on now, so thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Chardét. It was such a beautiful conversation. And there were things that we talked about today that I'm like, I don't know if I've talked about those things before. So thank you.
I love that. Maybe it will be inspire the next book.